There is a lot of advice out there on how to approach learning the piano, but who better to get insights and advice from than those that are considered the best pianists of all time? So let's get into it. Vladimir Horowitz was a Russian-American pianist, although he was actually born in Ukraine. And he was born in 1903 and died in 1989 at the age of 86. And he said, piano playing consists of common sense, heart, and technical resources. All three should be equally developed. Without common sense, you are a fiasco. Without technique, an amateur. Without heart, a machine. Now, Horowitz was known for being very, very technically good on the piano, and he makes really difficult pieces look very easy. Having said that, he was also able to play very musically without looking like he was playing musically. He seemed very composed and measured when he was performing, and he actually played my favorite interpretation of Schubert's Impromptu No. 3, which is a very sensitive piece. Many players find themselves at some point focusing very heavily on their technique, yet technique is just our ability to translate what's in our head to our hands. And so it's much more important to have something in your head to start with, something I am very often accused of not having. To me, what Horowitz is saying is that you need common sense, because without common sense, you're going to be doing very weird things on the piano and using very odd fingers and things like that. And you also need heart so that you are able to relate to the piece of music and convey emotions to an audience. And then you need technique in order to be able to translate that emotion to your hands. Horowitz also said, false notes are human. Why does everything have to be perfect? You know, perfection itself is imperfection. Perfection is a kind of interesting concept because in order to have perfection, you have to have imperfection. Particularly when it comes to learning something like the piano. There would be no point in learning the piano if you could already play everything you wanted to play on the piano. And therefore, by definition, you're going to play imperfectly in the pursuit of playing something perfectly. But it's also important to realize that you're never actually going to reach perfection, and you shouldn't be striving to actually reach perfection. Because value and finding something meaningful is often in the imperfection of the music. For example, the idea of tension and release in music. Having a very tense chord that then resolves, the tension can feel quite uncomfortable and therefore doesn't feel very nice. But when you resolve it, then it feels very nice. And this is why there is so much value in the imperfection, because the imperfect tension makes the perfect resolution feel better. And the exact same applies for learning the piano. The only value in getting good at learning the piano is the fact that at one point, you weren't able to play the piano. It's being imperfect and making mistakes that makes it so valuable when you no longer make those mistakes. Arthur Rubinstein was a Polish-American pianist who was born in 1887 and died in 1982 at the age of 95. He said, I was born very, very lazy and I don't always practice very long. But I must say, in my defense, that it is not so good in a musical way to over-practice. When you do, the music seems to come out of your pocket. If you play with a feeling of, oh, I know this, you play without that little drop of fresh blood that is necessary, and the audience feels it. Now, it will come as no surprise that most pianists who are considered the best of all time have done a lot of practice. However, when you are practicing, there comes a point in that practice session when your concentration starts to dwindle. And the first thing to go when you start losing concentration is musicality. And if you practice a piece in an unmusical way too much, then that's going to translate to the final version of the piece that you play. And the audience will indeed be able to feel that you are just playing the notes because that's how you've practiced it, rather than trying to create a meaningful performance. I think the important lesson here is that it's okay to not practice for very long. Actually, for most people, practicing for shorter periods of time is much better because not only is it easier to build the habit of practicing regularly, but it also means that you have a lot of concentration and you can be really effective with the time that you're playing. Rubinstein also said, when I sit in Paris in a cafe surrounded by people, I don't sit casually. I go over a certain sonata in my head and discover new things all the time. I often get a lot of comments on videos and messages asking me how do you know how to convey a piece of music. I am actually doing a masterclass on that on the 29th of March. Have you ever looked at a piece of music and felt like it's speaking a language that you don't fully understand? Learning to understand music is much like trying to understand any language. When you look at words on a page, the grammar, the words that are being used, the context all tell you the story that's being told. And music is no different. So if you want to learn and truly understand the notes that are on the page, on the 29th of March 2025, I'm running a live online masterclass called The Art of Understanding Music, where I'll show you what features in the music tell us how the music feels. And I'll show you how to translate notes to narrative so that you can play in a way that connects with people. So if you want to reserve a spot, check it out with the link in the description. The thing is, music can have lots of different meanings, and it's about looking at things in the music and developing an interpretation and a story that fits with what's been written on the page. And this is why you will see that many players play things in different ways, because they've all taken the same information and they've come up with the story that they think the music represents. The thing is with music is that we can generally intuitively feel the meaning of a piece. We can feel if a piece of music feels sad, happy, excited, manic, depressed. So we can take this feeling that we get from the music and we can almost reverse engineer what about the music makes it feel that way. And the meaning of the same piece of music can change over your lifetime as well. So how I conveyed a piece of music when I was 15 will be very different to how I convey a piece of music now, just based on my own life experience. And therefore the meaning of the notes, the chords, and the other elements in the piece of music change. Martha Argerich is an Argentinian pianist who was born in 1941 and is now 83 years old. And she said, "Audiences are not important for me now, and they never were." Now, Martha Argerich has a very calm demeanor when she's on stage, much like Horowitz in that sense. And for many experienced pianists, this actually comes not from experience, although that does help. The more you are on stage, the less nervous you're going to get playing. But actually this comes more from placing more importance on the piece of music and giving that piece of music to the audience than it does about thinking about yourself. And I think what Martha Argerich is saying here is that the reason the audiences aren't important to her is because she cares more about the piece of music. Rather than caring about whether you are being judged by an audience, care about being the messenger and telling the story of the piece of music to the audience. Gould was a Canadian pianist who was born in 1932 and he died in 1982. He said, "We do not play the piano with our fingers, but with our minds." So this tells me that although Gould was very technically able on the piano, he also placed much less emphasis on technique rather than conveying the music. It's very easy to fall into the trap of learning to play the piano rather than learning to play music through the piano, which is a very subtle but distinct difference in approach. He also said, "The purpose of art is not the release of a momentary ejection of adrenaline, but rather the gradual lifelong construction of a state of wonder and serenity." In today's world, it's easier than ever to look for that quick win, and to some degree, starting an instrument kind of requires that, because if we really did acknowledge how long it would take to learn an instrument, we will probably never start. At some point, most musicians come to terms with the fact that you will never finish learning the instrument. It's a little bit like saying, I want to finish learning to read and learning the English language. There are always going to be new words and words that I've never heard before, but when I'm reading a story, I'm not really thinking about how well I'm reading the story. I'm focused on telling the story and thinking about the meaning and the narrative. And this is why approaching music with exploration and curiosity is going to win in the long term, because it's really about storytelling and doing that through the instrument. Daniel Barenboim is an Argentinian Israeli pianist, and he was born in 1942 and is currently 82 years old. And he said, "Every great work of art has two faces, one towards its own time and towards future, towards eternity." Now, this doesn't just apply to music, this applies to pretty much any art. If you think about any great story that's been told through a piece of art, not only does it say something about the period of time that that piece of art was made, but it also says something about humanity, and it kind of has a greater message that outlasts the original reason for that piece of art. And there's no real better example that I can think of this than Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony. That piece was written in a time under Stalin's regime, where if composers were writing pieces of music that weren't approved of by the regime, then they would go missing. Shostakovich actually received quite a lot of criticism for his Fourth Symphony, and so if he didn't write a good Fifth Symphony, then that could very well have happened to him as well. Yet because Shostakovich was quite a rebellious character, he decided to kind of straddle the line with the Fifth Symphony of a piece that was rebellious, but also did kind of conform in a mocking kind of way. And you can absolutely hear this in the music. You can hear that it kind of has that Russian military regime sound to it, but at the same time, it's quite rebellious and groundbreaking. And that piece of music very much has a meaning within the time it was written, but also it has a wider meaning about humanity and something that still is relevant today. And that is the struggle between doing something that is right for ourselves and doing something that is right for others. This is a concept that can apply and relate to so many different situations, no matter when in time that is. And it's also why the music will continue to be relevant for future generations. Art Tatum was an American jazz pianist who was born in 1909 and died in 1956 at the age of 47. And he said, "There is no such thing as a wrong note, it just depends how you resolve it." Now this is an interesting one because this is much more practical than the other ones, which were much more about the meaning of music and how you approach playing music. But contrary to popular belief, and much like Art Tatum says, there is no such thing as a wrong note in isolation. Playing any key on the piano isn't inherently wrong. If I were in the UK and I said, "Can you pass me the chips?" I would probably receive some French fries. But if I was in the US and said, "Can you pass me some chips?" I would probably receive some potato chips. And if I was in a casino and said, "Can you pass me some chips?" I would probably receive some poker chips. In each of these three different contexts, I've used the exact same words, exactly the same sentence, yet I've received something completely different. Music is much the same. If you play a note on the piano, this can be used in a lot of different contexts and mean something completely different. For example, if I play a C sharp and I am in the key of D major, then this sounds like it makes sense because there is a C sharp in the key of D major. However, if I was to play a C sharp in the key of C major, this would sound a little bit more obscure because there isn't a C sharp in the key of C major. The note is exactly the same, but the context is very different. And we actually understand music largely through the context in which you are playing it. For example, you can play a chord that sounds horrendous, but if you surround it with chords that lead to that chord and then resolve from that chord will no longer sound horrendous. For example, if I play 3 consecutive notes on the piano, this by itself sounds like just a bunch of random clashing notes because I'm playing consecutive notes. Whereas if I play them in a context like this, I'm still playing 3 consecutive notes, but in this context, it makes sense. This is why you can get away with playing wrong notes in a piece of music if you resolve it correctly. For example, if I'm playing in the key of C major, which is just the white notes, if I play a black note by accident, I can resolve that note in a way that makes sense, and then that black note, retrospectively, won't have sounded like it was wrong. So if I play something like this, and then play a note that sounds like a mistake, but then justify that note, then it's no longer a mistake because I've resolved it in such a way that makes it make sense. The beauty of music is that as a listener, we aren't always sure what key you're playing in or where you're traveling to or if you're changing key. So if you play a wrong note on the piano, all you have to do is recontextualize that note so that it makes sense. So if I wanted some chips and I wanted the proper version of chips, which is French fries, then all I would have to do is travel to the UK and then I would get what I wanted. And if I'm playing in the key of C major and play a C sharp and I want this to make sense, all I have to do is travel to a key where this makes sense. There are a lot of approaches to learning the piano, and a lot of different pianists will give you a lot of different advice. But I think the best piece of advice is to just stick at it for a long period of time. And you will notice as you get better that the way you perceive music and the way you approach playing music will change. If you want to know 6 mistakes that you could be making on the piano that could be sabotaging your piano playing, then head on through and I will see you there.